right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today here on Point of View. We certainly hope you had a wonderful weekend and hope many of you went and saw the movie Risen. If not, my commentary is on that today. And of course, we had the South Carolina primary for the Republicans as well as the Democratic caucus. Then we are, of course, going to reverse that. And then tomorrow will be the Republican caucus in Nevada and then the Democratic primary in South Carolina. And so we're kind of in the valley here. That's always an opportunity between two events to talk about a few other things. But before we do, I will say a few things now, and then in the second hour, we want to go into a complete analysis of what happened in South Carolina because it is indeed significant. It was not supposed to be a winner-take-all primary, but it turned out that way. 50 delegates up for grabs, and all 50 went to Donald Trump, which I think begins to suggest why, first of all, that Jeb Bush stepped down and suspended his campaign, why many people think it's time for Ben Carson to do so, but we'll talk more about that in the second hour, and John Kasich hopes to maybe do well in Michigan, but we'll see where that goes. But you cannot explain what happened to Donald Trump in South Carolina without using the name Jerry Falwell Jr., because in some respects that changed a lot of the dynamic. If you want to understand just the evangelical vote, think about this. You had a lot of evangelicals in Iowa, and if you looked at this, interestingly enough, at the Iowa entrance polls, 62% or almost two-thirds of the people identified themselves as white, Christian, evangelical, born-again individuals, and Ted Cruz captured 33%, and Donald Trump 21%, and so Ted Cruz won Iowa. South Carolina was a complete flip. You have, again, 67% of those voters identify themselves again as white, Christian, evangelical, born again. And in this case, you would have thought that Ted Cruz would do well, but because of the endorsement by Jerry Falwell Jr., and of course we could talk about Robert Jeffress, who was supposed to be in the studio last week, and some others, this time it was completely reversed. Donald Trump grabbed 34% of that vote, and Ted Cruz trailed at 26%. We'll get into that in a little more detail and talk about what that means later. And in the second hour, if we have a little time, we'll also talk about the ongoing controversies that I said will be around for some time. The one between iPhone and the FBI in terms of unlocking that particular iPhone that was held by the San Bernardino shooter, and also maybe a little bit into the replacement for Justice Antonin Scalia. So we have a lot to cover, but we thought that as we are again between two different events, a primary that took place on Saturday and a caucus that will take place tomorrow, wanted to alert you of another book that I think would be very important that just came out this month, and it's entitled Reaching Your Prodigal. What did I do wrong? What do I do now? And this is a wonderful book that I think would be very helpful to you if you have a prodigal or if you know someone, which I think fits almost everybody, because how many times we see young people go off to college, they go off into the military, and they come back, and no longer do they want to go to church, and they're pretty much have given up on the church. And so we're going to see if we can begin to develop some very key principles. Matter of fact, 6 principles we're going to talk about in this book. And Phil Waldrep is with us. He is an ordained Southern Baptist minister, a speaker, and an author. Leads one of the largest religious conference ministries in the United States and formed a Phil Waldrep Evangelical Association. And we have links to his website. And, of course, you can also go to one by going to reachingyourprodigal.com. It will take you right down to philwaldrep.org. But either way, we have links for that on our website. And Phil, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Well, thank you, Kerby. I'm honored to be here. You know, I'm one of your most faithful listeners, and I think Point of View is such a wonderful program. And so to be with you today is an honor beyond words.
Well, it's an honor to have you because you've done the research. You've interviewed at least 30 different prodigals. You've studied the Scripture. You've developed 6 different principles. And as I said before, some people are just going to be paying rapt attention because they've seen their son or daughter walk away from the faith. But everybody else probably knows somebody who has seen that phenomenon. And when I first joined Pro Ministries, we used to have a brochure that said, when your kids go off to college where they lose their faith. Well, that was 40 years ago. So you can begin to realize that this is not a new phenomenon, but you've done some background research. And before we get into the principles, talk about how you kind of glean some of this information.
Well, what I started out was because people were asking me and sharing with me about their kids that had walked away from the faith, and they always asked me the same two questions. What did I do wrong? What do I do now? And so I set out not only to study what the Scriptures teach about wayward children and rebellious children and some of the examples in Scripture, but I sat down and I talked with prodigals, but I zeroed in on 30 prodigals that I had very in-depth discussions with that went more than just asking them to fill out a survey. And they encompassed everything from kids that were morally good kids. They weren't doing anything destructive, but had no interest in spiritual things or being involved in church, all the way to every kind of addiction you can imagine, to one who was incarcerated for a very serious felony. And as I listened to their stories, everything began to unfold, not only scripturally, but everything began to unfold as to what I was discovering in their lives. They all seemed to be telling me the same story in different versions. And so out of that grew, as I went back to the Scriptures, especially the story of the prodigal son, who I really like to call the story of the wonderful father, because the father did everything right in that story. And I was able to go back and out of that come up with practical things, very practical, not just in theory and research, but practical things that parents can do that I have discovered is making a difference in reaching their prodigal and getting them back into a right relationship with their Heavenly Father.
Yes, and I'm glad you called it that because, the story of the prodigal son is also the story of the wonderful father. And in some respects, that answers that first question, what did I do wrong? Because I can't think of a parent that I've ever chatted with who didn't, if they lost a son or daughter who walked away from the faith, wasn't convinced that they made a mistake. Now, I've had some say, I raised 3 identical children, 3 with the same household, the same rules. 2 are walking with the Lord, and 1's walked away. And so sometimes they recognize that maybe they didn't do anything wrong, but there's just a sense of guilt that's on the shoulders of many of the parents that have prodigals listening to this program right now. True?
Oh, absolutely true. As a matter of fact, I find most parents, whether they want to acknowledge it or not, have a sense of guilt. They must, we must have lived in the wrong location. We must have sent them to the wrong school, or I didn't handle the situation right. And I'm very quick to say there are times when we as parents make mistakes, but we're not perfect human beings. And I went back and went to the Scriptures and talking to these prodigals, the one consistent thing they told me was, I don't blame my parents. My parents didn't do anything wrong. And I know there are people, often who don't have children, who tend to come forward and say, well, I think if you do it right, your kids always turn out right. And I always look at those people and I ask them a simple question that puts it in perspective. I ask them, if you think a parent can do it right, it means their kids always turn out right. What did God do wrong with Adam and Eve?
That's good. I need to take a break, but when we come back, another way we can do this is we've all seen situations, and I've met individuals on college campus where they are really strong Christians, and later on I'd say, tell me about your family life. Oh, well, my mother was a prostitute, my dad was into drugs, and I'm going, and you turned out this way? I mean, there's a good example there of parents doing everything wrong, and you end up with these very strong Christians. So you can see it both ways, but we need to take a break, and when we come back, let me first of all encourage you to get something to take some notes, because we're going to talk about the fact that there are different kinds of prodigals, and then we're going to encourage you maybe to number 1 to 6 and look at these 6 principles that I think would be helpful to you. We'll continue our conversation as we talk about this new book, Reaching Your Prodigal, right after these messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
What would the crucifixion and resurrection look like through the eyes of an unbeliever? That is the question answered in the new movie Risen. Last week, I was able to interview Rich Peluso, who is the senior vice president of Firm Films, which the movie takes the familiar story to all of us who are Christians and helps us see it through the eyes of Clavius, a Roman tribune who is second in command to Pontius Pilate. He is charged with confirming the death of Jesus Christ and then releases the body for burial in a tomb. He is then called back to check the tomb and guard it. We learn that it takes 7 men to just roll back the huge stone in front of the entrance. He then places ropes and the official Roman wax seal on the tomb, and he posts guards on the tomb. When the tomb is reported empty, Pilate demands that Clavius find the body. The guards lie about what happened. They say they fell asleep and that the disciples stole the body. Clavius is skeptical about their report given the physical evidence at the tomb and continues to look for the body by tracking down the disciples. This part of the film has all the elements of a first-century detective story. The acting and production values are well done. Joseph Fiennes, who was in Shakespeare in Love, plays Clavius. Tom Felton, who was in Harry Potter, plays his aide Lucius. Christians and non-Christians should enjoy the movie, and the film also provides a context for an evangelistic and apologetic discussion of the resurrection. We see and hear elements of the biblical narrative strung together along a storyline of historical fiction. So I think this film will provide Christians with another resource to present the life, death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Columbia Pictures, LD Entertainment, and Affirm Films present Risen, the Resurrection Through the Eyes of a Non-Believer. Risen, now playing, rated PG-13.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Talking about those prodigals in your life. Reaching Your Prodigal is the title of the book. It's published by Worthy. You probably can find the book in your local bookstore, but we have links to Phil Waldrep's ministry. And, of course, you can just go to reachingyourprodigal.com to find out more as well. Phil and his wife, Debbie, are the founders of the popular Women of Joy conferences, and Phil also has founded the Gridiron Men's Conference and Celebrators, and so all sorts of things that they're doing apart from this. But I think you're going to really benefit from this book because it takes the time to really, first of all, interview some of those individuals who have walked away from the faith, and then second of all, really tries to apply biblical principles. And so, Phil, let's for just a minute talk about the different types of prodigals. This is one of the great insights in your book. I mean, I guess this is one of those things where we sort of know that because some are leaving the faith because of intellectual reasons, others because of maybe some religious problem that they've had. But you really kind of break it down to at least 5 different types of prodigals, and as a result, that maybe helps us understand how we would respond to those individuals.
Well, it does, because, you can make a whole list. You could say there's the drug addict prodigal and the alcoholic prodigal, and you could break it down into subcategories. But I basically found that you can take all prodigals and generally put them in one of 5 categories. Now, the most common is what I call the complacent prodigal, which is the one that sometimes we don't think about, and it's just the kid that doesn't have any motivation. They may say the right things, they may agree with you, they agree with their parents, and it translates into their life. They don't have any motivation to get a job, they don't want to go to school, and yet they have no religious interest at all. Another, probably the one we think of the quickest, is what I call an embarrassing prodigal, that are doing things that are embarrassing to us.
Yes.
They may be, partying a lot. They may be, living with their girlfriend or boyfriend, and they're not married. And then there's also the defiant prodigals, and they're the ones who parents really struggle with the most because they intend to hurt the family. They may actually be a danger to the family. They're trying to embarrass a mom or dad. It's almost like they're trying to get even for something with some of their inner struggles. And, of course, there's intellectual prodigals, kids that have gone off to college and now they've kind of abandoned their faith and they blame it on hey, I've been enlightened, and so they kind of reject Christianity, but on an intellectual level. And then a prodigal we often don't think about at all is a religious prodigal. What do you do when your kid has gone off and joined a cult, or they've joined, and become a member of the Buddhist or, Islam? And that happens quite as well. So basically I say, there's embarrassing prodigals and there's defiant prodigals, intellectual prodigals, complacent prodigals, and religious prodigals. And you can put them all in one of those 5 categories generally.
Well, and you point out that sometimes the response is different because oftentimes with a defiant prodigal, we're kind of on our defenses because we're actually upset about the fact that they are attacking us, or even the intellectual prodigals is a little bit of that. But the complacent prodigals, we're just more frustrated with them. We just want them to get off the dime. The religious prodigals, we're talking about maybe even trying to get a counter-cult group or maybe try to rescue them in some way. And nothing else, that part of the book was just a great insight because it helped me realize that as we go through this, and I want people to be careful to have the nuances here, we aren't talking about a one-size-fits-all answer because, indeed, although there are a lot of similarities, and all the prodigals you said had a similar story, some of the ways in which it's manifested in our families, in our communities, in our churches is very, very different, isn't it?
It is very different. In fact, the way we approach them sometimes is totally different. For example, I would not approach a defiant prodigal the same way that you would approach a religious prodigal. Because, with one, there may need to be a good discussion about faith. The other one obviously doesn't care about faith. So the way we go about it, at the core, I think we basically relate to them the same. But there are those individual differences that come into play into the prodigals as well.
Well, and again, let's talk about the different ways in which we respond. Let's take 2 extremes. I'll just ignore it. Maybe he or she will grow out of it. On the other extreme is nagging. I'm going to bring it up every single time I see him or her. Neither of those extremes are going to work very well, are they?
No, they're not. First of all, let me address nagging. One of the things when I interviewed prodigals, and we really got down into some deep details of their life, and they was open about it, one of the things that parents did that really was a negative is their parents, they could never have a conversation with their parents that their parents did not bring up the fact that they weren't going to church or they were doing things that was destructive. And one of the things I discovered is prodigals generally are aware of where they are spiritually and what they're doing. And yet when parents constantly nag about it, they start avoiding their parents because they know what's going to come up. And one of the things that when I wrote Reaching Your Prodigal that I wanted parents to understand is there's ways to respond and to have a relationship without having to constantly state your position. There are things you can do without saying anything that often has a greater impact than if you just constantly nag and nag and nag, and that doesn't do it. And the other extreme, as you said, Kerby, is we go the other extreme, we just totally ignore the prodigal. And that's equally as wrong because then we say we don't care, and that's the way the prodigal will interpret it. They expect us as believers, as Christians who are active in church, they expect us to be concerned for them, and sometimes they translate ignoring them as our lack of love for them. Yeah. So I do tell parents, you've got to be engaged, but you don't have to nag all the time.
One other one I might just point out is fixing the problem. And as we get into the book, of course, you are quoting from, for example, Jim Dobson and others, for example, tough love and all sorts of other issues. Because sometimes when you're dealing with addiction, sometimes when you have a child that is in jail, you want to help them out, but there are issues of boundaries and steps that you cannot take or should not take for their own good.
Absolutely. And it's not just when they get in jail. We think of that one. But what about the kid who refuses to get a job or go to school, yes, and all he wants to do is sleep to lunch and play video games? Well, at that same time, we can enable him and rescue him by providing all of he needs. We give him money to go buy food. We give him money for entertainment. We allow them to stay at home with no responsibilities or chores. So there's the other extreme. Yes, there's the side, and we'll talk about it, I'm sure, of not rescuing them when they get in jail or there's problems. But there's the other way we enable our prodigals, and that is when we just simply allow them to do what they want to do. And that's not responsible parenting, and it certainly is the wrong way to get your prodigal back to the Lord.
Let's look at those 6 principles. If you've got something to write with, you might number 1 to 6. And number 1 is get over the guilt. And, of course, that's the subtitle of your book, Reaching Your Prodigal, What Did I Do Wrong? What Do I Do Now? The first issue is you have to begin to readjust your own emotional setting, don't you?
You do, and here's why. Parents always feel like they did something wrong. That's why their child is a prodigal. And the result is they feel guilty. But when a parent feels guilty, now the prodigal and the devil is in a position where they can manipulate the parent. And I like to throw the devil and say, the devil comes to us and keeps bringing up our children and how they're in sin. And so we don't have any joy in our Christian life. We don't want to teach a class at church. We don't want to sing in the choir. We just want to kind of go to church and sit on the back row because we're embarrassed and we feel shame for our child, when really we're feeling guilt and we feel it's our responsibility. Then when you have a prodigal, especially a prodigal who is engaged in some kind of addiction or some kind of embarrassing behavior, they can manipulate you by getting you to rescue them every time they get in the pig pen. Let's go back to that story in Luke 15. What if the son, when he got in the pig pen, what if he started, and of course he didn't, but what if he had started sending messages to his father? Well, it's your fault I'm in the pig pen. Send a servant with soup and a sandwich, If the father felt guilty, he would have constantly sent him soup and a sandwich. It would have gotten him out of the pig pen, but it would have not gotten him home. And so the first thing parents must do is get over the guilt. And I say again, what I said a moment ago, if you think it's your fault, I always tell parents, you start out by asking the Lord first, what did I do wrong? And allow the Lord to reveal. Sometimes he may call to your mind something. For example, I've talked with parents who said, I had an affair and it wounded my child. And of course, we'll talk about that more in a minute, about asking forgiveness. But if you know what you do wrong, then you deal with it. But until the Holy Spirit reveals it to you, or you're made aware of what you did wrong, you must assume you did nothing wrong. And don't feel guilty. But once you are able to get guilt behind you, you're now in a position of strength, not weakness, and you can have victory, not defeat.
Title of the book, Reaching Your Prodigal. We'll continue our conversation with Phil Waldrep, but if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Perhaps you've had a prodigal, perhaps you have had victory, or perhaps you're still in the midst of it. Love to hear from you. We'll be back right after this.
Later this year, for the 58th time, America will choose a president. As a Christian, what are you doing to prepare for the election? Helping you cut through the major media spin is part of the mission of Point of View. We want to provide the best election resources, including a new website, Pray, Organize, Vote, encouraging people to intercede for the upcoming election, to help you get registered so you can exercise the stewardship of voting, to share things to help you get people involved and out to the polls. But to do all of that, we need you to vote right now with your support for Point of View. Show us that you're in this for the long haul as a citizen of heaven as well as the United States. Click Donate Now at the top of the page and give the most generous one-time gift you can at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. There is a lot of work to be done. Let's get to it together. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with Phil Waldrep as we talk about his book, Reaching Your Prodigal, What Did I Do Wrong? What Do I Do Now? Published in the bookstores by February 23rd, which is his website, philwaldrep.org, or probably easier to remember, reachingyourprodigal.com. But again, we have all the links on that in our website. And along the way, as we look at some of these principles, we certainly want to take a phone call because sometimes that will illustrate some of the points. So let's head out to Ohio first, WGGN. Chris, thank you for joining us today.
Good afternoon, gentlemen.
What is your story?
Yes, I have a prodigal son of my own. He is 28. And for about 7 years, he denounced Christ and claimed to be an atheist. And he lived with us on and off. And we finally got rid of our guilt, me and my wife. And many of times evicted him from our home because we have also little children and didn't want that to be an influence. But over the years, we just prayed. We kept doing our thing when he was around, prayer and talking, but never nagging. And just last week, last Thanksgiving, the week before Thanksgiving, he called us and said he wants Jesus. And we just talked for hours, and we were just celebrating, crying. Our little kids woke up. They were just jumping for joy. And now we can see the whole transformation of him from the inside out, and it's just so cool that his struggles before were just struggles, bad luck, and now when things are going bad for him, God gives him his needs, he just celebrates that God is good to him. So it's just so cool that I would say to parents, never give up.
Oh, that's good.
What a great story.
Our church prayed, the men's group for 7 years, we prayed just to bring him salvation and just to never give up on your kid.
Chris, thank you so much for sharing that. I want to get back to some of those principles, but, we could just end right there, couldn't we, Phil? Because, again, it's, I think, an illustration of the fact that we shouldn't give up. And, of course, principle number one is getting over the guilt. But let's talk about principle number two, removing the barriers. You sort of are alluding to this because sometimes individuals were wounded in some way or other. And so if there is a barrier, then it is our responsibility as parents to begin to deal with that and to ask forgiveness for anything that we may have caused.
Well, it is. And sometimes there are things that are a barrier in the mind of the prodigal. And I think if we can have an unemotional conversation with our prodigal, we allow them to share that. Sometimes it's barriers that maybe we as parents, we did something wrong, maybe we sinned. Like, for example, I know parents where they had an affair and maybe God worked in the heart of their spouse and their marriage was restored, but they never talked about it with their children. But then there's other barriers that get erected that we did with the purest of motive. For example, I talked with a young man recently who was a prodigal, and he brought up that his father traveled when he was a young man and was away, and his father was trying to make a living. His father had a good job. He was a salesman. He was over a large area, and so he was gone quite a bit of the time. And his father kept trying to justify it by saying, but I had to make a living. This was my job. And when I talked to his father, I said to him, look, stop trying to justify it. You got to see it from his behavior. You know in your heart your motive was pure. But why don't you look at him and say, son, if I had it to do over, I probably would do it different if I had known it was hurting you that way. And ask for his forgiveness, even though what you're asking for may have been pure. Because from his perspective as a young man, he saw that you were trying to avoid time with him. That's not true. So if you keep trying to justify it, you keep pushing them away. I think it's okay for us as parents to sometimes say to our kids, when I look back, you're exactly right. I probably was away too much. Didn't see it at the time, certainly didn't mean to wound you. And so when we start removing those kind of barriers, what we're removing is their excuses. And so they don't have any excuses anymore. They don't always grant us forgiveness, Many times they look at us and say, I can never forgive you. But at least when we've acknowledged we were in error, or at least we, looking back, made a poor decision, such as being away from home or things like that, it does remove the barriers, and that helps us bridge the communication gap once we're honest and admitting, hey, we made mistakes, we committed sins, or we did do something wrong.
Again, just so many great insights in each one of those chapters, but I'll keep it moving so we can obviously cover all 6. We've talked about principle number 1, getting over the guilt. Principle number 2, removing the barriers. Principle 3, extending unconditional love. Now, I think that should be obvious, but it was important to have that in a chapter because sometimes we get into, well, if your behavior is good, then we'll extend love to you. But if it's not, there are times when we have to exercise tough love. So help us kind of find that boundary of where we obviously need to step out of their lives and sometimes let them deal with the consequences of whatever they're dealing with. But on the other hand, still communicate unconditional love.
One of the things I discovered when I started talking with parents is most people think they know what unconditional love is, but many of them really do not understand it from a biblical perspective. Unconditional love says, I love you the same regardless of your behavior, whether you are the best kid in the community or you're the most defiant, embarrassing prodigal in the community. My love for you is exactly the same. That's the kind of love that God had for us. And I'll tell you where that is manifest. It's sometimes in things we say or things we think. For example, if a parent finds himself thinking, wow, I wish this kid had never been born, I'm not sure that's unconditional love for that child. Or if we certainly say to a child, I wish you was like, and call a name of another child, then that begins to say, my love for you is conditional. But it also is revealed with how we handle situations. When I wrote Reaching Your Prodigal, the book, there were 2 illustrations that I give in that chapter, and I think it illustrates it well, of 2 fathers who learned that their teenage daughters were pregnant, and how each daughter went and told the father. Neither daughter, both daughters were going to give birth to the child. They were not going to have an abortion. And the first father, who was a very respected man in the community, got angry. How could you do this? And he immediately told his daughter to get her stuff and leave. Even though she come to him tearfully and acknowledged that what she had done was wrong, he still reacted with anger and made her leave the house. It was coincidental, I guess, that in that same man's life was his pastor, who 6 months later got up and shared with the congregation that the pastor's teenage daughter was pregnant as well, and she too was a teenager who wasn't married. And the pastor, though, with tears said, we're embarrassed, we're hurting, but we're going to support our daughter. We're going to love her through this. She's acknowledged, her sin before the Lord. We're going to help her rear the child. And even though both fathers were ashamed and both fathers were embarrassed by what their daughters had done, I always tell people, could you look at that and tell me which one extended unconditional love? And then my next question is, would you like to guess which of those 2 girls is in church serving the Lord today? So my love can never, as a parent, can never be dependent on the actions of the child. We don't love our kids more when they love God. We don't love them less. That is a God-sized love. But then, if I can, Kerby, hasten on to the very next principle, though, unconditional love does not mean I give my kids everything they want and I make life easy for them. In fact, real unconditional love says, is what we referenced earlier with Dr. Dobson had called tough love years ago, is where I love you so much, I'm going to let you face the consequences of what you do. I'll walk you through it. I'll be there for you. As I tell people, you can extend grace the first time because some kids do get in trouble and learn the lesson. But when behavior is repeated, then we can say to them, I'll come see you every day in jail. I'll come visit with you, but I'm not going to get you out of jail. I'll go with you to counseling for your gambling addiction, but I'm not going to pay your gambling bills. And so we have to be willing to let our kids face the consequences, and when we don't, we'll see behavior repeated.
So again, for those of you taking notes, that 4th one is allowing the pain of wrong choices. So again, getting over the guilt, number 1, removing the barriers. Number 3 is extending unconditional love, which we just talked about. And number 4, allowing the pain of wrong choices. We need to take a break. We'll come back and talk about watching your words and praying the hard prayers. But again, this is just a very brief summary of a 220-page book that really addresses this issue of reaching your prodigal. And I appreciate Chris calling in with his story, because it was a story of victory. Perhaps you have some others. We'll see if we can fit some in, but if not, let me encourage you to get a copy of the book. It arrives in the bookstores tomorrow. Forward by Dr. David Jeremiah, endorsed by a number of individuals that I think you would find very helpful. And whether you have a prodigal or not, you probably someday will run into someone that does. You may know someone right now that needs to know about this, and maybe you should tell them about this interview or send the podcast to them, and certainly tell them about the book. Let's take a break. We'll continue our conversation with Phil Waldrep in his book, Reaching Your Prodigal, right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes with Phil Waldrep. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. I have a lot more time in the second hour for your comments or questions, but we'll see if we can get one in before the top of the hour. The book is, again, entitled Reaching Your Prodigal, What Did I Do Wrong? What Do I Do Now? It is published by Worthy. As I mentioned, 220 pages, but about 20 of those pages are in the back. Questions for personal or small group study. For some of you, you might be in a church, a small group, or others where some people that you are ministering to actually are struggling with this issue of prodigals. Perhaps you are a pastor of a church and you know that this might be a need, and this could be a Wednesday night or a Sunday morning study that you could have for a couple of weeks where individuals would read a chapter and then you could really minister to those who are struggling with prodigals. So again, let me encourage you to not only think about this in terms of the need you might have if you have a prodigal in your life, but other people that you might be able to minister to. So again, we've talked about getting over the guilt, removing the barriers, extending unconditional love, allowing the pain of wrong choices. Let's talk about, real briefly, Principle 5 and 6. Principle 5, watching your words. Principle 6, praying the hard prayers. Phil, what would you suggest there?
Well, when you say guarding your words, I think it's very important for parents to know when they say things that are negative about the church or people in the church or maybe staff members of the church, the devil has a way of magnifying that in the ears of your prodigal. So one of the things I discovered is that many times as parents, we say things, we really don't mean it as harsh as it sounds or as critical as it sounds, but instead of being words that are negative about church or church leaders, we should speak words of affirmation and positive words. One prodigal said this to me. He said, I don't understand my mother. She tells me how bad her preacher is and she doesn't like the music and she's real upset about some of the things a major committee in her church has done. And then she's shocked on Sunday when I don't want to go to that church. And so I really caution parents, and it should be about our Christian life anyway, that we should be affirming, not critical. But our words are very important in what we say and how we say it. Sometimes when kids are prodigals, all we can say is negative things about them. But when they do something we can affirm, we should affirm. And even if it's, they may not be in church, but at least they're holding a job. Well, let's affirm the good behavior rather than just always criticizing what they're doing wrong. And then when I talk about praying the tough prayers, there's really two things I discovered that got the attention of prodigals. One was the influence of a friend, their age, who has a heart for God. So the very first thing you pray is, Lord, bring into the heart of into the life of my prodigal friends, co-workers, people who are associated with them, who have a heart for God, and through the friendship, they could nudge them back to the Lord. And the other one is when we pray as parents, Lord, whatever it takes, I'm willing to do it. If it means that I have to suffer and I have to go to heaven, if that's what it takes to get the attention of my prodigal. Because I discovered, Kerby, that one of the things that got the attention of prodigals was the sickness and death of a parent or grandparent. It's one of those moments when they really pause and look at their own life. Now, I'm not saying God's going to take you to heaven or you're going to be sick, but if we can pray that prayer and mean it, all this other stuff is easy.
Wow. Just very powerful. Of course, we had Chris call in just a minute ago. That'd be a good way to have ended the program. But again, it shows the power of those very important prayers. But I just a minute ago mentioned, because I didn't want to run out of time, the fact that you really do have a very significant section in this book where people can do this in terms of a personal study or a small group study. And Phil, I know we have quite a number of pastors and Bible study teachers, Sunday school teachers, small group leaders, and others that listen to this program. And it does seem to me that this is something that could be an outreach. And we have outreach right now for individuals that have lost loved ones. We have an outreach usually in churches for those who have been through divorce. Why not an outreach for individuals that are dealing with a prodigal in their lives?
Totally. In fact, my book originally grew out of helping pastors to have materials, because they had heard me teach this material when I speak in churches. And as a result, many of them asked me to give a format so that they could use it. And some of them already have groups, and they have been amazed at how many people in the community, even people who maybe are not affiliated with their church, want to come. Because, one of the things that happens when you have a prodigal child, especially when they're engaged in embarrassing behavior, is, first of all, they want to know, can anybody give me some guidance? The second thing is they want to know they're not alone, because we sometimes feel isolated. We're the only person in our whole city that has a prodigal, because people don't often share or talk about their prodigals. When they have a safe area where they can come, get biblical counsel, walk through experiences together, and encourage and pray for each other, it is one of the most profound ministries churches are having today. And I do encourage churches, not just because I wrote the book, but I can tell you it is making a difference in the lives of people. And when you have that study, don't be surprised how many people come and how many people are involved, and it becomes an ongoing outreach to those people as well.
I've seen it work very well. We had a fundraising event a while back here in Dallas with Point of View, and one of the mothers came, joined us for a little bit, but then said, I have to go to our meeting, which we have for parents of prodigals. And so I was well aware of the fact that some churches do have a ministry like that. And I just want to encourage more and more churches out there to think about this as another very important ministry that would certainly heal the hearts and the wounds that many parents have right now.
Well, it is true. And the thing that I love about working on this issue with prodigals, and the things that I tell people that motivates me, is when I hear from people like Chris, who really have come to the point where they want to give up, but they don't give up, and they keep doing the right thing. So it's one of the things Chris said when he called a moment ago, was he remained consistent and in what he did, and he made the tough decisions. I don't know if you remember, he said there came a point when he had to ask his son to leave the home. And that was a tough decision, but guess what? Then he gave us the other side, that his son had come to know the Lord and was now serving the Lord. It was doing the right things that helped his son come to the end of himself and ultimately back to the Lord.
So again, book is entitled Reaching Your Prodigal. A lot of ways to go to it. You can go to reachingyourprodigal.com, which has been a resource that we've talked about. Or, of course, we have philwaldrep.org. Either way, and you can find that link on our website. We've made it very easy to do. And if you'd like to join the conversation, let me see if I can slip in one more phone call in just a minute. But, Phil, talk about what people will find when they land on your website, because there's some great resources there as well.
Well, they do. When they go, they'll find out about some of the conferences that we do around the country. You referenced that we do Women of Joy, which is a large Christian women's conference. We have Gridiron Men's, and we have Celebrators, which is, we don't say senior adults because nobody wants to be a senior adult. We call it a conference for mature believers. Everybody likes that. But it's where we get to invest in the lives of people and do it in helping build the local church and local church leaders, because we believe that's very biblical to do that. And we'd love to have people come, and if they do, make sure they tell me that they heard about us on Point of View. I'd love to hear that.
Very good. Let's go to Missouri real quickly. KNEO. Katrina, maybe you can share in just a minute about your own experience as a prodigal.
Well, I would like to encourage the church, the body of the church, to realize, too, that there is no accidents, that everybody is placed in the path of somebody for a reason. I myself was a prodigal, and I was going down a path that honestly not very many people thought that I would be able to get off of. And when I look back in my life, I realized that God had placed different individuals in my life, even in high school, that I didn't realize until later when I had that deep conviction.
Yes.
I could see where these individuals were trying to make a connection with me, and I didn't see it until later. But when the church, and it wasn't my family, it was the church that came to me as a prodigal, and they spoke to me, and they had the unconditional love for me despite what the community said or individuals in my family said. I just want to encourage the church to realize that sometimes they're the ones that encounter the prodigal.
Very good. Well, I wish we had more time, but Phil, thank you for joining us. Katrina, thank you for that testimony. We're going to take a break. We'll come back with more as we look at what happened in South Carolina. All that coming up right after this.
Columbia Pictures and LD Entertainment, in association with Affirm Films, the studio that brought you Heaven is for Real and War Room, comes Risen, the biblical story of the resurrection as told through the eyes of a non-believer.
The body has vanished.
His tomb is empty.
Risen, starring Joseph Fiennes, rated PG-13, may be inappropriate for children under 13. Now playing. More information is available at risen-movie.com.
Are you concerned about what's happening in our colleges, our marketplace, and the halls of government? Let me ask, have you invested in things that yield a good harvest? If you're already giving to Point of View each month, we thank you. You share in the reward for what we harvest. If you're not, now is the time. $30, $65, $100. The more you invest on a regular basis, the more we'll reap together. Give online at pointofview.net. Pointofview.net. Click at the top on Become a Monthly Partner or call 800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just thank God for y'all. I listen to you every day, truly. I wanted to thank y'all for everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
God bless you, Kerby, for keeping this show so on track and for the decades of wonderful help to this nation that Point of View has been. We're all big fans of your work, and we pray that God will just prosper it.
As a Christian, over the years that I've followed this program, I am constantly challenged to be on guard and to evaluate what's going on. And if for no other reason, to protect the caliber and the truth of your programming, I need to participate and to back your program financially to ensure that the truth stays out there for people to hear, to view, and to be a part of.
This is Point of View Radio.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour, we're going to spend some time talking about election 2016. First of all, I'd love to hear from some of you in South Carolina, because you actually were the ones that we were focusing a lot of time and attention on. And, of course, those of you in Nevada, we'll be talking about you, because tomorrow is the Republican caucus. So, of course, we also had a Democratic caucus out there. And as I mentioned, you'll have the Democratic primary in South Carolina next Saturday. So a lot is happening right now. And I just wanted to give you a little bit of a total on where we find ourselves, because in some respects, we still have a long way to go. And even in the piece that Ben Carson sent to me today said, well, it's a long way to actually reach that 1,200. But at the same time, if you can't win in Iowa or New Hampshire or South Carolina, and we'll see what happens in Nevada, there comes a point in time where you have to say maybe it is time to step down, and that's why Jeb Bush has decided to suspend his campaign. So now we're down to 5. Realistically, I think we're down to 2 or 3. But let's at least say that as long as John Kasich and Ben Carson have not suspended their campaign, we'll say 5. But I also recognize that somewhere along the line there needs to be a breakout somewhere. Let's give you a little bit of a perspective on this. According to the number of delegates that the Republicans have so far, Donald Trump has 67. Ted Cruz has 11. Marco Rubio has 10. John Kasich has 5. And then we'll ignore all the others except Ben Carson, who has 3. Jeb Bush has 4, but that will be insignificant. Carly Fiorina, Rand Paul have 1. Those are left over from the Iowa caucus. But realistically, there are still a lot of delegates to pick up. But the surprise for many of us was South Carolina on the Republican side, because even though it was not a winner-take-all, it ended up being that way, because Donald Trump got 32.5%. compared to 22.5%, 22.3% for Rubio and Cruz. He received all 50 of the delegates. And that makes a difference, because what it essentially says is that for all the time, energy, and money that was spent by Ben Carson, John Kasich, Jeb Bush, Ted Cruz, and Marco Rubio, the other 5, they ended up out of South Carolina with nothing, absolutely nothing. You can see why Jeb Bush would say, okay, enough is enough. I mean, more than, was it, $220 million have been spent trying to elect an establishment candidate, and Donald Trump keeps plugging along. So that's what has happened over the weekend there in South Carolina. I'm not going to say a lot about the Democratic caucus in Nevada, but let me just say a few things, because I suspect most of our calls and our comments will focus on the Republican side. And that is that when you go to the caucus that took place in Nevada, you have Hillary Clinton getting 52% of the vote, Bernie Sanders getting about 47% of the vote. And so as a result, Hillary Clinton picked up 22 delegates, Bernie Sanders picked up 16 delegates. But here's where, again, you're going to perhaps have some controversy in the convention, because Hillary Clinton now has 502 delegates, Bernie Sanders has 70. And this is not due to the fact that she has won overwhelmingly. No, she sort of won just barely in Iowa. She won by a few more percentage points in Nevada and lost big in New Hampshire. But it has to do with all of those super delegates that actually are already pledged to Hillary Clinton. Now, the point I'm making is that Bernie Sanders has won one election. He's going to have to win a few more, or this one is pretty much over on the Democratic side. What, of course, happens on the periphery What about some of the comments about her connections to Wall Street? What about the possible indictment for the emails? Are all important issues, but as we look at the electoral total, unless something remarkably changes as we come into what I call Super Tuesday, this is going to be pretty much over. And she probably will win next week in South Carolina. Then you go to our dozen either primaries or caucuses following that on March 1st, and I think it will pretty much be over for Bernie Sanders, and that will be really the coronation that many were expecting for Hillary Clinton, which, interestingly enough, this time 8 years ago, it still was somewhat of a competitive race, although it looked like Barack Obama was going to start pulling ahead, and really after the Super Tuesday that took place last March 2008, it really was pretty much over. It may be again. So that's why we're going to focus most of our time and attention on the Republican voting. And I want to look first at South Carolina and then look ahead to what is going to happen in some of the Super Tuesday states. And since I'm broadcasting today from Texas, I'll use Texas as an example to show you how this gets kind of complicated very quickly. And I won't take us into the weeds too much, but I think it is important to understand what actually happened. And Donald Trump, in light of the fact that he won by more than 10 percentage points over either Marco Rubio or Ted Cruz, was able to collect all 50 of the available delegates. Now, later on, there are going to be a number of other primaries where it's winner take all. This one isn't one of those, but it became that. And so as a result, you can see how this is really putting a tremendous amount of boost and momentum in the sails of Donald Trump. And if you heard me in the first part of the program today, I pointed out that there probably is the best reason for that, and that's the name Jerry Falwell Jr. Christopher Ruddy's been on this program with us before. He wrote this in Newsmax, and you can read it there in its entirety, but let me just summarize it really quickly. And that is, he says Trump's big win Saturday night falls largely in the shoulders of the son of the late, great Jerry Falwell Sr. Because indeed, when Jerry Falwell was invited, Donald Trump to Liberty, he wasn't the only person to speak at Liberty. And think how Ted Cruz must feel about that. Ted Cruz actually announced his desire to run for the presidency at Liberty University. And then later, of course, Jerry Falwell Jr. has been very fair to bring in Bernie Sanders, and of course even brought in Donald Trump. But after he brought in Donald Trump, he really endorsed him. Not just, said, well, he's a nice guy, but really endorsed him, and that made all the difference in the world. And as I said before, if you go back and look at Iowa and look at those individuals in the entrance polls, and these are fairly accurate, but there's a little bit of room for maybe a little bit of reevaluation. They found that about 2/3 of the people in Iowa identified themselves as white, Christian, evangelical, born again. But of those, nearly 2/3, that's actually 62%, Ted Cruz captured 33% of those. Donald Trump only took 21%, and so Ted Cruz won. When you ask in South Carolina the same question, you have 67%, so it's a little bit higher percentage of white, Christian, evangelical, born again. And this is where you would have expected Ted Cruz to do as well in South Carolina as he did in Iowa. Not true. In this case, Donald Trump grabbed 34% of that vote, with Ted Cruz getting 26% of that vote. Now, when we come back from the break, I'm also going to talk about something else, and that is a number of individuals. Almost a fourth of the people that voted in the South Carolina primary were not Republicans. It's an open primary, and so they were Democrats or in some cases independents, and we'll talk about how they voted for people like Donald Trump, Marco Rubio, Ted Cruz. But I'd also love to hear from some of you. Perhaps you have been on the ground there in South Carolina. Maybe you cast a vote. Maybe you have some comments about how the campaign was run. We want to give you that opportunity to address those issues, so feel free to give us a call, 1-800-351-1212. We'll talk more about what happened in South Carolina, what's coming up in Nevada, right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
What would the crucifixion and resurrection look like through the eyes of an unbeliever? That is the question answered in the new movie Risen. Last week, I was able to interview Rich Peluso, who is the senior vice president of Firm Films, which is a division of Sony Pictures. That night, I was able to attend an advanced screening of the film. The movie takes the familiar story to all of us who are Christians and helps us see it through the eyes of Clavius, a Roman tribune who is second in command to Pontius Pilate. He is charged with confirming the death of Jesus Christ and then releases the body for burial in a tomb. He is then called back to check the tomb and guard it. We learn that it takes 7 men to just roll back the huge stone in front of the entrance. He then places ropes and the official Roman wax seal on the tomb, and he posts guards on the tomb. When the tomb is reported empty, Pilate demands that Clavius find the body. The guards lie about what happened. They say they fell asleep and that the disciples stole the body. Clavius is skeptical about their report given the physical evidence at the tomb and continues to look for the body by tracking down the disciples. This part of the film has all the elements of a first-century detective story. The acting and production values are well done. Joseph Fiennes, who was in Shakespeare in Love, plays Clavius. Tom Felton, who was in Harry Potter, plays his aide Lucius. Christians and non-Christians should enjoy the movie, and the film also provides a context for an evangelistic and apologetic discussion of the resurrection. We see and hear elements of the biblical narrative strung together along a storyline of historical fiction. So I think this film will provide Christians with another resource to present the life, death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Columbia Pictures, LD Entertainment, and Affirm Films present Risen, the Resurrection Through the Eyes of a Non-Believer. Risen, now playing, rated PG-13.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Once again, I love the intelligence of our callers because one of the articles I've posted today is how Marco Rubio won Nikki Haley's endorsement and clinched second in South Carolina. And as I look up here, there's a caller that wants to talk about that. So let's go to Chip. I guess you're a first-time caller. Thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Well, thanks for taking my call. I am a first-time caller.
Well, what about this? Because, of course, your governor actually endorsed Marco Rubio, and that allowed, I think, Marco Rubio to come in second. Now, again, this is really close. It was 22.5%, 22.3%, but still, second place is second place. And I think the endorsement of the governor, as well as, of course, I might just mention Tim Scott, who is your senator, as well as Trey Gowdy, who's one of your representatives, probably helped as well. But you wanted to make a comment, so I want to give you the floor. What would you like to say?
I did. Looking at the results with Trump getting 32.5% of the vote, and then it's Cruz and Rubio split after that. The folks I've talked to around here, Nikki Haley carries a lot of weight. And I look at it as a testament that 67% of Republican voters in South Carolina voted against Trump.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think, and that may be the case. Donald Trump addressed that the other day and said, look, as these people drop out, it isn't like they're all going to vote for Rubio or Cruz, although I think a lot of them are. Matter of fact, the survey's done of Ben Carson, not that he only won about 7% of the vote, but nevertheless, that probably is the case, in that case, that most of them would go to Cruz or Rubio. Maybe most of them would go to Cruz, by the way, in terms of the last survey I've seen. But sometimes some of them, if they have a chance, will vote for Donald Trump as second. But I did have a poll that we posted the other day saying that when you ask people what their second choice is, most of the time their second choice is Marco Rubio. So it would be interesting to say, but your point is well taken. He's trying to say that just because I only get 32% now doesn't mean I'll get 32% later on. But in a two-man race, it's very obvious in most of the polling that Marco Rubio would beat Donald Trump. More recently, there's pretty good evidence that in a two-man race, Ted Cruz would beat Donald Trump. So I think your point's well taken.
Well, thank you.
And I appreciate you calling. Don't be a stranger. Call back again. I'd love to hear from you on that. And just before I take the next phone call, let me just mention that this piece that I've posted here goes into some detail. I thought it was kind of fascinating. How is it that Governor Nikki Haley decided to do this? And she actually had 3 dinners. But the bottom line is that she's always had a really good relationship with Jeb Bush. I mean, just before, as a matter of fact, she looked like she was going to win the governor's race. She even wrote to an individual who called Jeb Bush and asked, okay, what do I do if I win? And really began, and Jeb Bush even provided his former chief of staff, Sally Bradshaw, to help in the transition. So in some respects, her heart was for Jeb Bush, but she recognized that probably was not going to happen in South Carolina. So then she had a number of dinners, and she's also had a pretty close relationship with Chris Christie, but of course he dropped out. So that dinner that took place was insignificant. So then it ended up being with 2 dinners. One particular dinner, well, she did have one, of course, with Jeb Bush, but she also had one, of course, with Marco and Jeanette Rubio, and one with Ted and Heidi Cruz. And she found a lot of continuity and a lot of agreement and just basic emotional commitment and agreement with Marco Rubio. So that's why she finally decided, I'm just not going to stand back and not make a decision and not make an endorsement. And so she went out and actually endorsed Marco Rubio. And if you'd like to read the story, it's the second article. The first one's on Reaching Your Prodigal, which was a story we did in the first hour. The second one, Marco Rubio and South Carolina. And I have one on Hillary Clinton, which we'll get to later. It just tells you a little bit more about some of the behind-the-scenes discussion. And interestingly enough, now we move to the Super Tuesday, and one of those is Texas. And it is interesting because Ted Cruz is the senator in Texas. But so far, as of at least today, before I went on the program, the governor of Texas has not endorsed him. So we'll see if that changes or not. But it's kind of intriguing to do that. But I mentioned that we had an open primary, and Mike in South Carolina on the Good News Network wants to ask a question about that. So, Mike, thanks for joining us today.
In South Carolina, of course, we have an open primary where Democrats can vote and stuff like that. How do we change that to being a closed primary?
And I think that's a question that you may want to start asking yourselves. First of all, let me again give you the general numbers. About a quarter, I think it's 24%, but I don't have the numbers in front of me, but about a quarter of the people that voted in the Republican primary Saturday were not Republicans. Now, there's nothing that says that you couldn't switch parties, but because it is an open primary, if you voted time and time again, that's sometimes becomes a difficulty, because usually when you register to vote, you register as an individual, and then you are qualified for that primary. So to answer your quick question, Mike, really what we have to encourage some of the Republican leadership in South Carolina to do is to make it a closed primary. And that decision probably is now going to funnel through that, because as you had your vote there, most likely you also had your precinct meetings. Now you'll probably have your senatorial meetings, and then eventually you'll have your state Republican meeting and a convention that will probably take place in a couple of months. And I would encourage some of you that feel that you should have a closed primary to just let your elected representatives know, and these delegates, these 50 delegates, some of whom are, well, all of them at the moment are pledged to Donald Trump, to actually go to a closed primary and to express your opinion. So that's going to be really a responsibility for you there in the state.
Yeah, can these same people vote now in the Democratic primary this weekend?
Theoretically not. We still have some what we call voter irregularities even in the state of South Carolina, but theoretically, no, they cannot. Okay. So we'll see how that plays out. And of course, if you were with us on Friday, we had Chelsea here. And this was 8 years ago when she was a college student, so don't hold it against her. She was one of those individuals that, although she was a Republican, she actually voted in the Democratic primary because she wanted to be part of that Operation Chaos. You remember when Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama were running? And so she said she actually voted as a Democrat, but she couldn't then go back and vote because our primaries are all together. South Carolina is really odd in that theoretically you could vote as a Democrat in the Republican primary, and if the Democratic rolls were not well kept, you could possibly vote again. And we've seen how some of that has happened as well. So again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. I'd like to hear from all of you, but I always like to give preference to South Carolina. So one more South Carolina listener, in this case, Scott. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be on your show.
Well, I appreciate you joining us. What would you like to add to the conversation?
Well, I was interested because I've been following this, and I live in Hilton Head area. And I've noticed that, I was watching Fox News the other night, and they had a statistic on there that said that the candidate that most lined up with the evangelicals' belief was Ted Cruz. But then when people were actually voting, they were going to Donald Trump and some to the other areas. And I noticed that the church, or the evangelical church, is really not voting their values congruent with that statistic. And I thought that was pretty interesting, thinking about how we talk all the time about how the world is changing. And if the church is not sticking to its values and its faith, and they're not being adamant about being active citizens of the church, when we see the country kind of going downhill.
Yeah, well, and I think God is going to hold the people in the church as much responsible for some of the decline in America as anything. And again, I mean, I know we have listeners out there that support Donald Trump, and again, we'll probably get Robert Jefferson studio here, and if I could get Jerry Falwell Jr. in studio or by phone, I'd love to have them try to explain it. But I have some real questions, as you might imagine, about individuals who say, I'm pro-life or pro-family. I believe that the role of government should be limited so that we have a religious liberty, and going down more and more of these issues. Donald Trump says some of the right things, but you just have to wonder if those really are the case. And so it is amazing to me that in Iowa, a disproportionate number of individuals who are indeed Christian evangelicals voted for Ted Cruz, and he won. In South Carolina, it was just completely flipped, and a very high percentage of individuals who identify themselves as Christian evangelical born again voted for Donald Trump, and that's why he won. And if it even was split 50-50, then they would have split the delegates. But because Donald Trump won 32.5%, he got all 50 delegates. So to me, that's got to be very discouraging for Marco Rubio, Ted Cruz, but especially Jeb Bush, John Kasich, and Ben Carson, because they spent a lot of money, a lot of time in South Carolina, and came out with zero. And I think a lot of that goes back to the way in which some of the churches voted. So, Scott, I appreciate your phone call. I'm coming up to a break. Otherwise, I'd keep on a little bit longer. But when we come back, we'll take some more phone calls. And I want to look ahead to talk about how some of these particular primaries are complex. And if you'll permit me, I'll talk about what's going to happen in the state of Texas, since I've been able to research that one, but it's typical of some of what we're going to run into in the next couple of weeks. So let me give you a preview of coming attractions that'll be taking place right after these messages.
Later this year, for the 58th time, America will choose a president. As a Christian, what are you doing to prepare for the election? Helping you cut through the major media spin is part of the mission of Point of View. We want to provide the best election resources, including a new website, Pray, Organize, Vote, encouraging people to intercede for the upcoming election, to help you get registered so you can exercise the stewardship of voting, to share things to help you get people involved and out to the polls. But to do all of that, we need you to vote right now with your support for Point of View. Show us that you're in this for the long haul as a citizen of heaven as well as the United States. Click Donate Now at the top of the page and give the most generous one-time gift you can at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. There is a lot of work to be done. Let's get to it together. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour. If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. I'll take one more call from South Carolina, but then I'll give those of you from other states, if you would like to join the conversation. We would certainly like to hear from you because, after all, some of you are going to vote very soon. As I mentioned before, the Nevada Republican caucus is tomorrow. We'll talk a little bit about that on Wednesday. That's not insignificant. There are 30 delegates there. And when you realize that in South Carolina there are 50, you can see how that will split up a little bit. The Democratic caucus doesn't take place until much later. Actually already took place. Excuse me. I was looking ahead because I was thinking about the other caucus up there in Alaska, because you have the Alaska Republican caucus that's March 1st and the Democratic caucus is March 26th. But let's look ahead for just a minute, and then I'll take a call from South Carolina. And that is, those of you in these states, on March 1st, you get to vote. And that's Alabama. And then I just mentioned Alaska. Of course, they have the Republican caucus. Then you also have a vote in Samoa. You have lots of times people saying, well, you only have 11 primaries. Well, actually you have 12 because Samoa, but it's only 11 states have primaries. Then, of course, Arkansas. So if you live in Arkansas, Colorado, Georgia, Massachusetts, Minnesota, Oklahoma, Tennessee, Texas, Vermont, Virginia, you will be voting on March 1st. Some of you might have already done early voting. And in the Republican side, these are all up for grabs. As I mentioned before, the Democratic side, I think it's pretty much over. You look over that list and you say, well, are there any ones that Bernie Sanders can win? Well, yeah, he'll win Vermont. I mean, if Bernie Sanders cannot win Vermont, he's really in trouble. He might win Virginia. He might win Minnesota. Could win Colorado. We'll see. If that's the case, it still becomes competitive. But when you come to the Republican side, very different. And in just a minute, I want to show you what's happening, for example, in the state of Texas, which has the largest delegate count, 155, which is more than all the ones taken up until this point, and how that splits may determine whether or not Ted Cruz goes on, whether Marco Rubio goes on, or whether Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio become footnotes and Donald Trump wins and sweeps. So we'll see how this plays out. But let me take a phone call. One more from South Carolina. Listening again on the Good News Network. Jim, thank you for joining us today. What would you like to share with us? Do we have Jim here? Did I hit Jim?
Can you hear me?
There you go. My fault.
Yeah.
We just had problems with the computer. You're on.
Okay, I was kind of in a low area. I'm a first-time caller. I live in the Aiken area. In fact, I heard you when you came to Augusta 2, 3, 4 years ago. Can't remember now exactly when.
That's very nice of you. And I'm planning to come to South Carolina again, so we would love to meet you again, and we'll see you in your part of the country as well.
Great. I listen to you when I can when I'm driving the car. I am a Christian. I'm a evangelical voter. Spent 25 years in the Army as well. But and I'm very, very frustrated that Donald Trump is doing what he's doing. I'm a Ted Cruz supporter. I voted for Ted Cruz. I listen a lot. I read a lot of Joel Rosenberg stuff, and he had a great piece, something like, 42 reasons why Donald Trump should not be president. It's fantastic.
Yeah.
I've always voted my values, and I've been very frustrated, number one, anybody who'd vote for Trump, and number two, especially for my Christian friends who voted for Trump. And what the funny thing is, I can get none of them to admit to me they voted for Trump. It's like they don't want to admit it.
That's another part. You wonder about that, because even in these what are called entrance and exit polls, sometimes they won't admit it either. So that's really interesting. Go ahead.
Well, I've been frustrated. I said, well, why? Why are they doing it? Why are the evangelicals, true evangelicals, voting for Trump? And I heard something the other day, said, is this it? But to me, it's fallacious thinking. It goes something like this. Well, I'm a Christian, and I don't go along with your values, Donald, but I'll do my Christian thing. You leave me alone, and I just think that more than any other candidate, you're the strongest, and you're gonna do what you say. So let's just separate the two. See, we'll separate values from the job I think you're going to do. And I think that's the best explanation I've got anybody to tell me why people who are Christians are voting for Donald Trump. I mean, when you look at the fruit of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control, Donald Trump doesn't score very high on any of those. and I just don't.
Right.
I don't understand the rationale, and that rationale of, as I heard explained, I think it was on Fox News. I'll stay and I'll do my Christian thing, and this is my values, but I'm not going to vote my values. I'm going to vote for Trump because I think he's strongest. I think those people are wrong. I don't think they're thinking. I think it's also a combination of what I call the Bubba vote in South Carolina.
Well,
I would love to see
be
a correlation of, now, formal education is nothing, but I'd love to see a correlation of formal education to where people voted on. I don't think Donald Trump supporters are very high on that, and that's not to denigrate, people who do support him like that. And I have one more question. I'm going to look it up sometime. Maybe you know. I wonder how much money that Donald Trump has contributed to liberty and how much he's contributed to First Baptist Church of Dallas. Maybe I've just got a jaded opinion there, but I would not be surprised.
I will check that out because I'm pretty sure he has given to Liberty University, and we were supposed to have Robert Jefferson here, and if not on air, off air, I'll ask him, has Donald Trump ever given? And he might not know, or he might not tell me, but I'm glad to ask. It's a legitimate question. And as I said on this program many times before, and you've heard me say it, nothing's off the table. So if you want to put that on the table and ask that question, even if I don't, you can ask it to him when he gets on the program again. So it's worth the question to ask.
I appreciate it. And if anybody else can explain to me, as I say, why they're evangelical and why they're voting for Trump, please tell me. I really want to know. Thank you.
Well, Jim, I appreciate your phone call. And again, he mentioned that fact that part of the difficulty is that they do these kind of entrance or exit polls just to get a little bit of an idea. And still, a lot of people aren't necessarily saying they're voting for Donald Trump. But then you look at the final count and you're going, yep. And do you remember that we talked about a week ago that there was one poll that showed that Ted Cruz was leading Donald Trump, but it was an outlier? But I think it also gets back to the fact that in situations where people maybe don't want to say they are going to vote for Donald Trump, that has hurt him. And I think the Iowa caucus is one of those. It's one thing to say, I'm going to go in the polling booth and nobody knows and I'm going to vote for Donald Trump. It's another thing to stand in front of your neighbors in Iowa and say, yeah, I support Donald Trump. And they're going, really? Why are you? No. You got to support Ted Cruz. And so sometimes there is a difference between a caucus and a primary because you have to kind of defend yourself. And of course, in the privacy of the polling booth, you can vote for whoever you want. And a much higher percentage, interestingly enough, of individuals voted for Donald Trump. And you had, oh, by the way, I might mention this just in passing. We have had some of the highest turnouts ever in the various Republican cases. A high turnout in Iowa, high turnout in New Hampshire, and now a high 20% increase turnout in South Carolina. By contrast, not a lot of people are showing up for the Democratic caucus in Nevada. We'll see how it plays out in the South Carolina primary next week, but there seems to be a lot of enthusiasm. Now, some people are going to vote for Donald Trump, and obviously some people are coming to vote against Donald Trump, but the reality is there's a lot of excitement on the Republican side, not as much excitement on the Democratic side. Let me, just before I take another phone call, and you are welcome to join us today, and if we don't have time today, we'll give you some time tomorrow to just explain how they deal with these delegates, and I will use Texas as an example. In Texas, 155 delegates are at stake March 1st. But it's a weird kind of way in which they do this, because 3 delegates are allocated to every congressional district. There are 36 congressional districts in Texas, so 3 times 36 is 108. So 108 of the 155 delegates are selected in each particular area. Now, here's where it begins to really hurt Ben Carson, maybe John Kasich, maybe even Marco Rubio, but it certainly hurts John Kasich and Ben Carson. You have to get at least 20% of the vote in that congressional district to even qualify for a delegate. And if you get 50% in that congressional district, you get all 3. It's pretty easy to figure out. So in many cases where people know, say, Ted Cruz, he'll get 3, but there'll be some places where Donald Trump will get 1, or maybe they'll split it a little bit, so it'll be 2 and 1 or 1 and 2. I don't think, maybe Marco Rubio a few places, maybe in Hispanic area might get enough to go over the 20%, so he'll get some. So what could happen is you could see that maybe, let's say, Ted Cruz gets 40% of the vote, so you'd expect him to come away with 70 delegates, and that would put him in very good running with Donald Trump. But it has to do with how each individual congressional district is. So 108 of those 155 are actually determined by each congressional district. So you have to win all over the state, not just in your favorite parts of the state. And then the other 47, of course, have to do with how you won the state. And so it's just an interesting process. And it, I think, illustrates exactly what happened in South Carolina. It wasn't supposed to be a winner-take-all. It became a winner-take-all. That is, Donald Trump ended up with all 50 delegates. But with 155 in Texas, it's going to change some things. Love to hear from some of you in places like Georgia or Colorado or Minnesota or other places where we broadcast, in Vermont and Virginia. You're going to be voting soon. What do you think? We'll be right back.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Let me just mention that tomorrow we're going to be dealing with a couple of issues. One, as we wait for what happens in the Nevada caucus, wanted to have some guests in studio telling a really insightful and encouraging story from Uganda. But then the second hour, we'll get back to some of the political issues, as we do so often here on the program, and we're going to deal with this issue of an Article 5 convention. Now, we've talked about this a few times before, but I want to kind of get into it in a little more detail. So we'll have a number of individuals sort of address this issue, and both in studio, by phone, kind of talk about the points, counterpoints, what that might mean. And up until now, that's been a little on the periphery. And of course, if you've maybe read Michael Ferris, or maybe a couple of other individuals, certainly Levin, and some of the things that he's written about. There have been a few people that have talked about this, but now you have Governor of Texas, Greg Abbott, and others endorsing it. You've had some presidential candidates ask about it, so we're going to get into that a little bit more. So, of course, you've heard Mark Levin talk about it maybe a little bit if you've ever listened to his radio program or read some of his books, and we've had Michael Ferris on here before, but we're going to give you a chance to really kind of get into it in a little more detail, so that will take place tomorrow. So again, if you would like to join us for that discussion or have comments, pro or con, we'll certainly provide that opportunity for you. And one other issue before I take some more phone calls. A lot of people have said, why hasn't Ben Carson dropped out? I mean, he came in sixth. He did worse than even John Kasich, who really didn't even campaign in the state. John Kasich is hoping to win Michigan, and maybe he will, but he didn't even come in. And Ben Carson, you would think, would want to suspend his campaign just like Jeb Bush is. And, of course, I've got his note today saying, no, it's just a long way to go, and I'm going to keep doing that, and wanted to raise money. And some people are really just simply saying, maybe he's doing this for other reasons to help promote his book. Some have said it's a scam. But again, when you look at the fact that some of the statistics that people have been throwing around are, if it's true, say that 54% of every dollar he raises goes back into raising more money. It's like he's building a list. And so that's why some people are saying, maybe it's time for, a few of these that are further down the list drop out. I think it's really clear at the top of that list that if Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz were not running against each other, if one of them were to drop out, and it's not going to happen, then there would be the remaining individual really would give a run for their money of Donald Trump. And so this, in some respects, is what is helping Donald Trump. Number one, we just talked about, as we have with Scott and with Jim, the number of evangelicals who before might not have voted for Donald Trump and now have been given sort of permission to do so. But number two, because you have the vote scattered with at least Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz, that also has affected it, and is a little bit with John Kasich and Ben Carson. And we'll maybe see some of that tomorrow in the caucus. But in between time, let's take some more phone calls. So let's stay in South Carolina for just a minute and talk to Nick. What would you like to add to the conversation today?
Oh, did you say Nick?
Yes, Nick, you are on.
Yeah, okay. Well, I'm not Fayetteville. I'm in the Columbia area.
Oh, gotcha. Okay.
When that gentleman brought up about Donald Trump, I distinctly remember Jerry Falwell Jr. talking about Donald Trump and all he had to say, and then he said, he is a very generous man.
Yes. I took that to mean, yes, he's been very generous to Liberty University. Yeah.
What does that sound like to you?
Yes.
And Proverbs talks about a gift perverting judgment. And I think that some of these people are so blinded by money and power that their judgment is perverted, and I appreciate your time. I had to get that out there, and I wish that you would ask those two guys, and Sarah Palin as well. I think she's been bought off. How much money did they receive, or their university receive, from Donald Trump?
Yeah, and it should be a matter of public record. So I'll see if I can find that out. And so, Nick, you keep listening. And if I find out, like I said, everything's on the table. So if I find out, I'll post it on our website, and you can read it for yourself.
I really appreciate that, and I did vote for Ted Cruz Saturday.
Well, thank you for joining us, and boy, I got to get up there to Columbia and a few other places that I haven't been to lately, so that is a date that we will keep with those of you in South Carolina. Let's head up to North Carolina for just a minute. Almost out of time, but Andrea, WLGP, I know you would like to say something about Donald Trump, so you have the floor.
I just want to ask you, Kerby, nobody has said anything about his background as far as where his money came from. We know he has money. We know that he's a conservative Christian, but we don't know anything about the man. I wondered if you'd comment on where his money came from and all that to kind of give us some background on Donald Trump, please. Thanks.
Sure, and that probably is one where I could give you a very specific amount, so I'll give you a short general summary, and then we can come back and talk about that. He was fortunate to actually get started under his father's wing and was involved in real estate. And he said his father lent him $1 million. Well, I think we'd all could do pretty well in real estate, but he very quickly began to say, I'm not just going to build a building here in Manhattan or somewhere else. He wanted to begin to diversify, and so he began to diversify relatively early. And the diversification had to be in a lot of areas. In some areas, don't raise any moral questions. So the golf courses that he's developed and some of the very high-end resorts, those really don't raise any question. What did raise questions, at least for some Christians, is the buying and developing of casinos, the kind of various things that happened in those casinos, and we've talked about that a little bit before. So again, he received all sorts of benefits through various things by going to, chapter 11, chapter 13, I can't remember which one it was right now, and some bankruptcies and things like that. Sometimes he was buying companies and then they went into bankruptcy. He said he didn't drive into bankruptcy, but he just used the bankruptcy rules as he was acquiring companies. And so he very quickly diversified his holdings. And again, it's almost impossible to keep track of all of the holdings he has because they are so vast and he has so much money. And people have said before they think he's made this much money. He said, no, that's not right. And it might be even difficult to determine what his net worth is. But we'll see if we can explain that, because if indeed he becomes the nominee, that is going to be critiqued in a lot of ways by not only the Democrats, but even by some Republicans that are going to say, I'm not sure I can bring myself to vote for a man that put stripper poles and had gambling casinos and all sorts of things. So we'll see how that plays out. But nevertheless, that's an important issue that we will come back to. And I'll do my best to try to give you some of those facts and figures as well. We didn't have a chance to cover it today, so let me just mention before I leave that I am going to post an article for us tomorrow to look at over the battle between Apple and the FBI. And this piece in the Los Angeles Times is one of the best because, as you know, the FBI wants to be able to get into Farouk's iPhone 5, and he is, of course, one of the San Bernardino shooters. And the iPhone was actually owned by San Bernardino, and they could have been able to get in if they had access to it, but that's a whole nother story we'll talk about. The decision by Apple to not go along is certainly not without its critics, but then there are others that have been very concerned about this issue of security. So I'm going to post this because I thought it did a pretty good job of explaining the issue. And then I'll see if we can post this one, too, where the Apple attorney, who's Ted Olson, who we've had on this program before, and actually has spoken on a variety of issues before the Supreme Court, says that unlocking the San Bernardino shooter's iPhone would open a Pandora's box. So haven't had a chance to talk about that today, but we'll try to cover some of that tomorrow, or certainly Wednesday as we look at the Nevada caucus. Let me just mention as well that we will spend a little bit of time in the second hour tomorrow talking about this Article 5 convention. It's in the Constitution, Article 5. What about it? What are the pros and cons? We'll talk about that then. I want to thank Andrew, Catherine, and Shamila for their help behind the scenes. We're out of time, so we'll see you back here tomorrow.
A farmer will tell you that if you don't prepare the ground, if you never plant good seeds, don't expect a harvest. Weeds maybe, edible crop no. Achieving a positive result takes work and planning. If you're concerned about what's happening in our colleges, our marketplace, in the halls of government, let me ask, have you invested in pulling weeds and planting seeds? That's what the Truth Team at Point of View does. For decades, God has used this team to attack noxious mental weeds and to plant seeds of truth that have grown into changed lives. If you're already giving to this effort each month, we thank you. You share in the reward for what we harvest. If you're not, now is the time. $30, $65, $100. The more you invest on a regular basis, the more we'll reap together. Give online at pointofview.net or using the Point of View radio app, pointofview.net. Click at the top on Become a Monthly Partner or call 800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
I just thank God for y'all. I listen to you every day, truly. I wanted to thank y'all for everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we